You might think you know everything there is to know about Henry VIII. You'll know he married 6 times and had 2 of his wives executed. But the truth about our most famous king is much more complex and far more compelling. This series tells Henry's story over 6 of the most tumultuous decades in English history, separating the real man from the myth. To some, Henry was a cruel bully.
Henry was self-obsessed, desired admiration. He could never be wrong.
He wanted the theatre of punishment to be perfect. This is what happens when you defy Henry.
To others, he was a charismatic and successful ruler.
He jousts, he rides, he sings. What more could you want from this perfect prince?
But Henry's personality, his innermost thoughts and his motivations have remained elusive.
Today we might call Henry a little bit OCD.
It was said of him he couldn't hold somebody's gaze. He felt uncomfortable.
Now a team of Tudor experts have come together to investigate who the real Henry was. They'll unearth never-before-seen documents, including some from the Vatican's archives.
Thank you so much for showing me one of the greatest prizes in Tudor history.
And they'll go backstage at Henry's court to unravel a murky world of power, plots, and petrifying ambition.
The Tudor court is a bear pit. It's an aggressive and violent place.
When somebody is no longer useful to him, that's it, he cuts them out. It's almost pathological.
He was willing to change the entire country, even the entire map of Europe, in order to get what he wanted.
Henry VIII is born on the 28th of June, 1491. But he's never meant to be king in the first place. He's the spare heir, living in the shadow of his older brother, Prince Arthur.
As the second son, the younger of the princes, comparisons could be made with Prince Harry. In fact, Henry was known as Harry for much of his childhood, and there are some similarities physically as well. He was allowed, really, to be a little bit wilder, to indulge his favourite pastimes. He just didn't have the same pressures as his elder brother.
Henry clearly sees himself as the spare rather than the heir. I suppose in some ways that might be liberating, but in other ways it might nurture a certain jealousy. Henry later in life has this urge to prove himself all the time, to show that he can be a success even at his most...
Attendants spoiled him and made sure that the hard knocks and bruises of boyhood weren't inflicted on their charge, and anything he wanted, he got.
As the second son, Henry is ignored by his father, and instead raised by his loving mother in the protective female world of Eltham Palace.
Henry's relationship with his mother was unusually close. His mother seems to have taken a real care for the education of her son. For a royal princess to grow up in this sort of environment wasn't that unusual. For a royal prince, however, it was a little bit strange, and it just goes to show how unimportant, really, Henry was considered in the line of succession.
But when Henry is just 10 years old, something happens that transforms his life. Unexpectedly, his older brother dies, leaving him as heir to the throne.
He's no longer the second son, he's the first son, and he's going to be King of England. It's hard for us to imagine the pressure on him, the idea of having to take up that position.
To make matters worse, Henry's beloved mother, Elizabeth of York, dies just months later.
Recently, this remarkable survival from Henry's childhood has been revealed to us, and it's incredibly exciting because for a long time it was thought that this was just an old page in an illuminated manuscript. But when we look behind this figure of King Henry VII here, we see King Henry VIII, as he later became, as just a boy. This weeping child on the edge of an empty bed, that of his mother. He can't contain his emotion. His head is thrown into his arms in despair. We imagine Henry VIII as being someone that maybe didn't feel emotion, that wasn't affected by grief, but we can see in his reaction to his mother's death that it really broke his heart. He was now the heir to the throne, and he didn't have his mother to guide him. He had instead a very different figure in his father, a very problematic, I think, figure to try and move him into this new phase of his life, and I don't think that made it any easier for him.
Henry's father, Henry VII, won the Wars of the Roses, a bitter civil war which lasted 3 decades and divided the kingdom. As the first Tudor king, he united the warring houses of Lancaster and York. But he now reigns over an unstable and uneasy peace.
Paranoia was part of the Tudor DNA. The Tudors really had a rather tenuous, legally fragile claim.
There is a seed of insecurity planted in Henry from a very early age. The political history of his father's reign has essentially been the history of plots, conspiracies, hanging over from the Wars of the Roses. Who's in, who's out, who's being watched.
Everything changes for Henry when he becomes next in line to the throne. He is now brought up directly by his controlling father, after years of being sidelined.
Henry's relationship with his father was really complex. There are lots of eyewitness accounts that Henry was never permitted to go out of the palace. He was kept to his rooms, and that when he did appear at court, he never opened his mouth except to answer a question. This is so different to the upbringing that Henry had known. He must have felt like a virtual prisoner.
As soon as Henry VIII is brought under his father's control, you see his personality just being squished, almost this overbearing weight of his father's anxieties, his paranoia, his concern that something might happen to this last vestige of the Tudor dynasty.
As a very young boy, he hadn't really had much of his father's attention at all. But then, of course, suddenly, Henry had too much of his father's attention. He found it suffocating because Henry VII was trying to make up for lost time and kind of chisel this young, wild prince into a future king. Sometimes they argued quite violently in front of the court. On one occasion, a scandalised ambassador reported it looked this evening as if the king might murder his son. Little wonder, there was a deeply personal resentment against his father.
After 7 years of living under this harsh regime, Henry finally glimpses freedom. His father is now dying, and Henry has been summoned to see him one last time. He knows that in a few short hours, his father will be dead, and he will be king.
This is a king who's dying, still not feeling anywhere near secure on his throne. He wants the Tudor dynasty to continue. So, to his last breath, he's giving advice to his son, how to secure the realm, what sort of advisors to surround himself with.
He told Henry that he had to marry Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his elder brother Arthur, and he would rule England with her. It wasn't a sort of if or but. This is what you're going to do. And Henry meekly accepted it.
At exactly an hour before midnight, Henry VII dies. In that moment, the 17-year-old Prince Henry.
Henry's feelings about becoming king would have been a mixture of apprehension about what was going to happen. Would he be able to smoothly take over the levers of power, mixed with a wonderful sense of relief that he was going to be his own man, his own master, and he could do things which he wanted to do instead of other people telling him.
Remarkably, no one outside that room will hear there's a new king on the throne for 2 whole days. The story of what happened in that 48-hour period has intrigued historians for centuries. The next 48 hours will decide the fate of the kingdom. As soon as the old king dies, his closest courtiers start plotting.
When Henry VII dies, there's essentially a court coup. His death is kept a secret for the best part of 2 days, while in the background they decide how to bring on this new regime with a splash.
Henry played a full part in this complete cover-up of his father's death. Of course, he had a vested interest in it because he wanted to secure the throne.
For Henry, this is his first real experience of the ruthless machinations of Tudor politics.
The Tudor court is a bear pit. It's an aggressive and violent place. Your best friend can become your enemy, and your enemy can become your best friend.
You need to be able to plan and plot your way through this vacuum of power. And in order to do that, you have to make sure that nobody knows the king is dead. Nobody has time to stage their own coup d'etat.
He must have been affected by this atmosphere of intense fear and suspicion, not knowing who to trust, being very, very aware that actually the Tudors were a fragile dynasty.
Henry is convinced that the biggest threat to his new reign is a rebellion coordinated by two of his father's most powerful advisors, Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley.
Empson and Dudley were the sort of slick apparatchiks that Henry VII brought in to enforce his will, and they resorted to unsavoury methods, rigging juries, accusing people of crimes they hadn't committed. Probably everybody disliked them.
Early on the morning of the 24th of April, 1509, after 48 hours in limbo, Henry VIII is finally proclaimed king. But at the same time, he issues orders for the arrests of Empson and Dudley.
Empson and Dudley are scapegoats. They're convenient. You get rid of them, you appear to distance yourself from...
I think people had underestimated Henry before because they may have thought that he was merely a puppet that his father was controlling, but now Henry makes it very, very clear he's the one calling the shots.
In the name of the king! Idiots! You're coming with us! Get your hands off me!
The arrests win the new king instant support with his people. But it's likely that Henry has an ulterior motive.
Henry VIII continued to resent his father for quite some time. He had had lots of his own impulses suppressed for years and years, and because Henry couldn't do anything about it as long as his father was king, when he was gone, well, there's an opportunity with Empson and Dudley to play out his irritations, his frustrations with his father.
Down the stairs!
On the same day, Henry issues a groundbreaking piece of legislation, a general pardon. This extraordinary document sees Henry explicitly criticize his father's reign.
What Henry is trying to do is to win popularity and quickly. So as well as getting rid of his father's despised ministers, he issues a general pardon to all of those who'd fallen foul of Henry VII's justice. So of course this makes him incredibly popular. People love him.
Now that pardon is basically rubbishing Henry VII. This is an extraordinary move that you use your father's unpopularity to sell yourself to your subjects. Henry's telling his subjects that he knew they had suffered grievously through injustices imposed by his father, and he was happy to do all he could to right those wrongs.
He wants to begin in a way that is going to make a break with the... Of course, it's all about reputation. It's all about this gleam in his eye that he's going to be a famous monarch, the best king that ever reigned in English history.
Henry is determined to distinguish his father's reign from his own. But that doesn't stop him honoring his father's dying wish and marrying his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, just 7 weeks after he becomes king.
Catherine is the most desirable bride in Europe, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the most mighty empire in the world at the time. But I think Henry really did love Catherine of Aragon.
He professes himself to be deeply in love. It's part of those early grand gestures which, he thinks he can make. But of course, he's also got an eye on security. And this is a monarchy, so it means dynastic security, so it means a son.
His attempt to produce a male heir was pragmatic. He did not intend that the decades of conflict that had preceded his father's reign would continue into his reign. And he felt that...
Producing a male heir soon comes true.
On New Year's Day, 1511, Henry does have a son. Catherine of Aragon gives birth.
Henry was beside himself with joy at having a son and heir. His hopes and dreams had been realized.
But Henry's happiness is short-lived. His newborn son dies dies at just 7 weeks old.
Henry doesn't seem to have responded very much at all to the news of his son's death. He does comfort Catherine, but there's no real sense from any of the chronicles or ambassador reports of this time that he is actually grieving himself. He is able to almost put a full stop on that child's life and move on from it. He has something intrinsic within him that he can just be cold, that he can shut down emotion.
Throughout their marriage, Henry and Catherine will lose a total of 6 children. And Henry's anxieties about having a son and heir will intensify as the years go on.
The big what-if of Henry's reign is, had that young Prince Henry, who was born on New Year's Day 1511, had he survived, everything would have been different. Henry would have had that son and heir from the beginning of the reign. He would have had dynastic security. Maybe he would have relaxed a bit.
When Henry lost his son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, he was also losing the opportunity to pass on his crown to a legitimised male heir. He must have wondered at that moment whether that marriage could produce a male heir.
After 5 years of marriage, Henry still doesn't have a son, and his new dynasty is beginning to show signs of vulnerability. To bolster his authority, he enlists the talents of a cardinal who has rapidly risen through the ranks at court.
Cardinal Wolsey is a political genius, a little mastermind. He's Henry's fixer. And, he does an incredibly good job. Of course, Wolsey was the man who would relieve him of all the tedious business of state. He's the guy who's going to help Henry fulfill his desires. If the king wants it, Wolsey will deliver it.
Wolsey is churchman, but let's just say he's not the sort of vicar that you'd sit down to tea and biscuits with. He likes the finer things in life. He insists on being served on golden plates. He surrounds himself by luxury, and he also has a few mistresses. He has at least one illegitimate child.
Thomas Wolsey is somebody who's come from a relatively poor background. He's the son of a butcher, and people will make jokes about this throughout his career. He's risen up through the church to become somebody influential, ideas into practice.
For Henry, Wolsey becomes indispensable. Henry has always loved outdoor pursuits, and whilst he hunts, jousts and fights, the cardinal takes all matters of state into his own hands.
Henry in his 20s is often described as the most handsome prince in Europe. He was 6'1", stood above the other courtiers, and he certainly stood above the general populace. They could see him coming.
One of the really important things about Henry and Wolsey's relationship is that Henry really does believe that Wolsey is his friend. They walk about together arm in arm in the King's privy garden. Wolsey can always walk in to see Henry. He doesn't need to make an appointment. Other ministers can't do that.
Wolsey, he sees a huge opportunity for himself here, and he takes it. According to most courtiers, he has absolutely no right to be there. He's of lowly birth. He's worked his way to the top, which is highly unusual. But Henry really doesn't have that same snobbishness that the rest of his court have.
Within a few years, Henry raises Wolsey to become his chief counsellor and one of his closest friends. Hidden away in the archives of the Vatican Library in Rome is a remarkable account written by a 16th century Italian diplomat, which reveals more about their relationship than anything else. The Vatican has never given permission for it to be filmed before.
Well, thank you so much for showing me this work. This is the first time, though, that I've seen the original, so it's an absolute privilege.
This wonderful work, which is called Anglica Historia. It is about the history of England and the king himself, Henry VIII, Arrigo VIII.
The wonderful thing is, for a historian, is this is an eyewitness account of Henry VIII and his court. One of the best bits of his account is his description of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, so Henry VIII's right-hand man. I mean, my Italian isn't great by any means, but I think in the page we have open here it says what good fun Wolsey was as well. He would sing and...
We talk about him, cantava, saltava. smiled, giocava, he told jokes.
So he would entertain and tell jokes, and you can see the appeal of Wolsey for Henry, I think, from this account.
At first glance, the document paints a picture of Wolsey as an entertaining member of Henry's court. But it's not what it first seems. It reveals that Wolsey
is not at all flattering about Cardinal Wolsey and the methods he employed to manipulate his royal master. He describes him as a witty fellow who would cling to the royal side, strum the lute, dance, indulge in pleasant conversation. He's almost doing his business by stealth. Henry doesn't realise all the things he's agreeing to, and that by these methods he would inculcate, instill and drum into Henry's ears all of the messages that Wolsey wanted to get across. My favourite extract comes when he kind of lures Henry in by showing him a pretty jewel or a ring. It's almost like he's treating Henry like a child, tempting him with sweets, and Henry then just agrees to whatever the cardinal asks of him.
Henry's weakness for flattery and manipulation allows Cardinal Wolsey to rise to the highest echelons of court. But in a few short years, Henry will turn on his close friend and advisor with a vengeance. Henry VIII is worrying over the future of the Tudor dynasty. He still doesn't have a male heir, and he's surrounded by potential rivals to the throne.
All his nightmares, all his problems haven't gone away. They've just been like good wine, lying there, getting stronger and more powerful.
As Henry gets into his 30s, we see little glimmers of paranoia to the extent that he has started to change his personality. He started to mistrust people around him.
As his paranoia grows, Henry increases the provisions for his personal security.
There is a quite extraordinary security service surrounding this king. His food is tasted before he's able to eat it. There's this elaborate ritual in order to put him to bed each night where the covers are checked for any knives in his bed. What effect that must have had on Henry, because for all his confidence and his sense of invincibility, he's made very aware on a daily basis that really he's incredibly vulnerable.
Henry's suspicions extend to the servants who surround him day and night.
The barber is one of the very few people who are allowed close proximity to Henry.
To be the royal barber means that you are holding a sharpened... You've killed a king, you've committed treason. And so, therefore, it's very clearly specified how a barber should be behaving, even what company they can keep. These increasing provisions come from his paranoia, and they also start to feed it, because every single part of Henry's life was underscored with this sense of unease and suspicion about the people around him.
Henry fears an uprising from a rival claimant to the throne. And he hears a rumor that the Duke of Buckingham is secretly plotting against him.
The Duke of Buckingham was the highest ranking nobleman in England, and he had royal blood and lots of it. Henry is particularly suspicious of Buckingham because he doesn't make any secret of his claim to the throne, nor of his desire to be king.
Henry's suspicions reach boiling point, and he writes a letter to Cardinal Wolsey that seals Buckingham's fate. Henry's letter survives to this day, and it's held here at the British Library.
It's extremely exciting for me to see this original letter by Henry. There actually aren't many of them because, as Henry himself says here, he finds writing tedious and painful. He tends to entrust that task.
Getting stronger and more colourful.
As Henry gets into his 30s, we see little glimmers of paranoia to the extent that he has started to change his personality. He started to trust people around him.
As his paranoia grows, Henry increases the provisions for his personal security.
There is a quite extraordinary security service surrounding this king. His food is tasted before he's able to eat it. There's this elaborate ritual in order to put him to bed each night where the covers are checked for any knives in his bed. What effect that must have had on Henry, because for all his confidence and his sense of invincibility, he's made very aware on a daily basis that really he's incredibly vulnerable.
Henry's suspicions extend to the servants who surround him day and night.
The father is one of the very few people who are allowed close proximity to Henry.
To be the royal barber means that you are holding a sharpened blade next to the King of England's throat. If you make one mistake, you've killed a king, you've committed treason. And so, therefore, it's very clear. These increasing provisions come from his paranoia, and they also start to feed it, because every single part of Henry's life was underscored with this sense of unease and suspicion about the people around him.
Henry fears an uprising from a rival claimant to the throne. And he hears a rumour that the Duke of Buckingham is secretly plotting against him.
The Duke of Buckingham was the highest ranking nobleman in England, and he had royal blood and lots of it. Henry is particularly suspicious of Buckingham because he doesn't make any secret of his claim to the throne, nor of his desire to be king.
Henry's suspicions reach boiling point, and he writes a letter to Cardinal Wolsey that seals Buckingham's fate. Henry's letter survives to this day, and it's held here at the British Library.
It's extremely exciting for me to see this original letter by Henry. There aren't many of them because, as Henry himself says here, he finds writing tedious and painful. He tends to entrust that task to scribes. So the fact this is in Henry's hand is hugely significant. This letter was intended for Wolsey's eyes only. It's top secret. So Henry is instructing Wolsey to keep good watch on the Duke of Buckingham. He effectively wants Wolsey to spy on Buckingham. He is Henry's prime target. He's the one he is most afraid of. Wolsey soon uncovers a whole raft of evidence that's enough to condemn Buckingham for treason. He's plotting rebellion. He's even stealing some of Henry's own servants and placing them in his household. Also, the thing that rankles most with Henry is that a monk has prophesied that Buckingham will be king. Well, for a man as paranoid as Henry, that really is going to be the nail in the coffin.
Wolsey's investigation produces enough evidence for Buckingham to be found guilty of treason. And he is beheaded by an inept axeman who takes 3 strokes to cut through his neck.
Henry's treatment of Buckingham is one of the earliest and most vivid indications of his brutality. This caused shockwaves across the kingdom. He wasn't going to suffer any hint of treason, even amongst the highest nobles of the realm.
Fearing further plots against him, Henry's attitude to his noblemen changes.
Henry starts to get rid of some of those older courtiers and councillors who had surrounded him for a long time. He mistrusts some of the old nobility. They'll have agendas of their own.
He replaces them with the promiscuous young aristocrats he grew up with, men he trusts. But with such a debauched entourage, Henry's palaces are transformed into houses of pleasure. Even though Henry joins in with all the fun, at heart, he's actually quite prudish.
You can almost picture Henry the morning after, walking through this scene of devastation with food strewn everywhere. There were people just sleeping on the floor wherever they could. Henry's a real contradictory character in all of this. On the one hand, he's encouraging.
so many places in his life where he then discovers he's not in control of things. He's not in control of whether his wife has a son.
A queen is there for one principal purpose, and that is to produce sons. Catherine's not doing that, and therefore, he's bound to look elsewhere.
Henry's attentions are turning to a young woman at court, Anne Boleyn. He's had affairs before, but this time things feel different.
Anne plays things slightly differently. As soon as it becomes apparent that Henry is considering the validity of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, she starts positioning herself as the potential future bride, and Henry is quite happy to go along with this. And so they start on this attempt to get Henry's marriage to Catherine declared invalid.
Desperate to end his marriage, Henry starts searching for a way to divorce Catherine.
Once Henry's decided that he wants to marry Anne Boleyn, he goes all guns blazing to research this himself.
He gets it into his head that the reason he has no sons is because he has transgressed that biblical rule in Leviticus that you must not marry your brother's widow. The thing about Henry is once he has his mind set on a particular course, he can be extraordinarily cold and ruthless in achieving it. And anybody who gets in his way, well, they need to watch out.
Henry tasks Wolsey with securing permission from the Pope to end his marriage.
With the divorce, Henry gives Wolsey an impossible job to do. Divorce isn't unheard of, but for a king to set aside a wife to whom he had been, the Pope is going to agree. And Wolsey must be thinking, I've got the boss from hell here. I just cannot deliver this. What am I going to do?
Wolsey's attempts to secure a divorce are failing. Losing patience, Henry takes matters into his own hands, and he initiates a very public trial of his marriage to Catherine.
From Henry's point of view, the divorce trial should have been a way to sort things out and get a legal ruling to get his own way. But the Queen comes in, she gets down on her knees before Henry, and she makes this extraordinary plea to her husband, asserting her role as his wife, pleading for her rights to stay in the marriage.
He doesn't react. There is nothing. He's not at all swayed by all of this emotion. This is an indication of that coldness just coming to the surface in Henry's character. It's almost like when he's decided that somebody is no longer useful to him, that's it, he cuts them out. He moves on to the next thing. It's almost pathological.
The divorce trial ends in failure, and Henry blames his chief minister.
Wolsey has genuinely tried to get Henry the divorce he wanted. And it's not really Wolsey's fault that this has not worked out.
After arriving at Leicester Abbey to spend the night, he collapses and dies.
In the aftermath of Wolsey's death, one of his servants goes to see Henry to try and persuade him to look kindly on his old servant. This is when we see Henry's contradictory nature, because Henry declares, if I could lay out £20,000 to bring back the cardinal, I would gladly do it. In the next breath, he reminds Wolsey's servant that his master had died whilst owing him £1,500.
After Wolsey's death, it becomes clear that the Pope will never grant Henry a divorce. But Henry is so determined to marry Anne Boleyn that he will stop at nothing to achieve it, to break with the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church.
He didn't want to be responsible to the Pope. He wanted to centralize power to himself.
It was the only way he would get a divorce. It was the only chance of having a son and heir.
Henry has started to radically change the course of English history.
He transformed every aspect of his kingdom, religious, political, but he's developed into a very different man.
He's moved from being someone who's a bit anxious and uncertain to someone completely convinced of his own rightness, the justice of all of his decisions. He was willing to change the entire country, even the entire map of Europe, in order to get what he wanted.
In the next episode, Henry turns on his new queen, Anne Boleyn.
The English court is a nest of hissing snakes. Absolutely nobody is safe.
This reads, her crimes were so abominable. Anne is the most wicked queen in history.
And Henry's paranoia begins to creep into England's politics.
Henry VIII comes down on opponents with murderous force.
You're either with him or against him. And if you were against him, you paid for it.
That's Bloodlust and the Boleyns, next Wednesday at 9. The potentially heart-stopping dangers of an asthma attack. Pulled into focus tomorrow night at 9 in brand new 999 Critical Condition. New next, the 20-year hunt for the killer newsreader Jill Dando, shot outside her house in West London. It was a crime that shook Britain. In just a moment.